start at the beginning of this book. This is a book that's coming out. It's finally almost here. This book is the product, really largely, of Pastor Lou's nagging and persistence. The number of times when he would say, "How's the book coming along?" And I would say, "I have not agreed to write this book. I like the idea of the book." But he was right. It was in my head for a really long time, and I just didn't actually think I could fit it into my life. So when somebody else said, "Do you think you have a book in your head?" I said, "Actually, I do." It was the only reason I really felt comfortable saying that was because of all these conversations. Did I just get very loud?
You're good.
Okay. So this is the book that's coming out with Bonnie Van Voorst's beautiful painting on it, which I love. So much. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is just pick up right in the middle of the book, the second half. But this should work, because the first half of the book was an introduction. Excuse me. Maybe I'll just put it here. The first half of the book was an introduction to philosophy, right? Why should Christians care about philosophy? What is it? And then the second half of the book is intended to really answer the same question, but through a demonstration. So rather than going through definitions of philosophy and the rules of philosophy, just showing some of the things that Christian philosophers talk about and why I think it matters to the church. So today, we're going to do what will be chapter 9 of the book, Suffering, Evil, and the Goodness of God. And it's a tough one. It's hard. And today, we're not really going to resolve it. I mean, spoiler alert, no one has actually solved the problem of evil yet. It's not something that philosophers or non-philosophers, like it's brokenness, right? As I actually say in the book, the problem of evil is just the reality of suffering in a world that we believe was made by a loving and good God. So it's hard. And I really am a big believer in taking the problem seriously and thinking hard about it without jumping right to the solution. Because sometimes when we jump right to the solution, we miss a lot of it, and we dismiss some aspects of it, right? And so today I'm mostly just going to talk about the hard stuff. And then next week, we'll talk about two promising ways that Christian philosophers have responded to this problem in a way that does help us to make sense of the goodness of God in a world with this much suffering. But fair warning, today is mostly about the suffering and the tension between our belief in the existence of a loving God and the reality that a lot of people suffer. And they suffer awful things, and it doesn't really seem to matter whether they love God or not, right? Anybody who's been in this church knows that people who love God are not immune from totally undeserved suffering, right? So that's today. Actually, no, let's just start with a word of prayer, please. I get nervous teaching here. Okay. Lord, thank you for this opportunity, for a church that is willing to have these conversations, for just for the blessings of all the things that Christian philosophers are doing, and just for your word. I pray that you will be with us today and guide our conversation. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so, let's go to the next slide. Can we have the slide, please? These are two quotes that I chose to start the chapter with. The one is David Hume. He writes, David Hume is a philosopher, and he's referencing an even older philosopher. Why? Because the problem of evil is about as old as philosophy. As long as we've been asking hard questions, one of the main hard questions has been, how do we make sense of the goodness of God and the suffering that we see? He says that curious as old questions are yet unanswered. Is he, God, willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he's impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? Right? If God is loving, then he should want to protect us from suffering. And if he is all-powerful, he should be able to. So then it seems like, if God is who we believe he is, we should be in a very different world than the one that we're in. This is sort of the core of the problem of evil. And then, in contrast, we have a quote from Timothy Keller, I think most of you probably know who he is, and that he has gone through suffering. He is currently dealing with a particularly aggressive kind of cancer. And in his book on the problem of evil, he wrote, "We are all sufferers, or we will be." And I love this because it's true. Some people manage to escape, everybody gets a cold, and everybody has to deal with some losses. But it's also true that there's no principle of fairness in distributing suffering. Some people seem to just get it piled on, and other people seem to make it to 40, never having gone to a funeral of somebody they really cared about. I was not that person. I was the person who lost a lot of people early on. It's probably why I wrote this book. And one of the reasons why I was able to go and pursue philosophy was that I had Christians in my life who encouraged me to think about the hard questions instead of encouraging me to ignore them. I can tell you right now, if I had been told to ignore them, I would not have, right? All right, we'll come back to that. I'm jumping ahead and already not paying any attention to my slides. So, for me, for most people, the problem of evil does not present itself as a philosophical puzzle. In fact, if the first time you encounter this problem is as a nice little argument that you've been given, you are blessed. Count yourself fortunate, right? Most people encounter the problem when they're like, what? God, how are you going to let this happen to me? Right? That's what it feels like. Because you know rationally that the world is broken, and you know rationally that God doesn't promise you get everything that you want. But you think certain things are protected, right? And you find that they're not necessarily. That you can even lose the things that you care most deeply about. That's how most people first encounter the problem of evil. And it's an emotional problem, right? And for me, when it first hit me, I remember I was about 15, and I remember thinking, it would be easier not to believe in God. I can give talks without crying, but I can't always give talks on this particular chapter without crying. So I'm going to do my best because there's an icon. But right, there's a sense in which it would be easier to just deal with the pain and not deal with the added pain of knowing that God let this happen. Because there's a sense, people talk about faith being a crutch, but sometimes it's a challenge. It's harder if you have to reconcile the fact that this stuff is happening to you, and you believe God could have stopped it, and he didn't, right? That's one aspect of the problem of evil, just what it feels like. But there's also this actual type philosophical conceptual problem we'll get to in a minute. But if we can go to the next slide for a second, I'm going to give one more contemporary statement by one of these. They're sort of called the New Atheists, although they're already called the so-called New Atheists. They're not that new. They were very popular for a while. It seems like maybe people think they did a kind of crash and burn. They were very popularly accessible. It's not great philosophy, so they didn't have the support even of atheists or philosophers. But you may still find that people encounter them and have their lives changed by them. So I'm not going to stop talking about them until my students stop talking about them. There's a guy named Sam Harris, who you may have heard, or may have heard of. And this, in particular, is from a paper, an article called "There Is No God, and You Know It." So he's talking about Hurricane Katrina. And he said, what was God doing? Well, a hurricane laid waste to their city. Surely he heard the prayers of those elderly men and women who fled the rising waters for the safety of their attics, only to be slowly drowned there. These were people of faith. These were good men and women who had prayed throughout their lives. Only the atheist has the courage to admit the obvious. These poor people spent their lives in the company of an imaginary friend. So, this is what atheism says, right? Why didn't God spare this? Why didn't God spare you of this? Because he's not actually real, right? So, we can go to the next slide for a second. This is a repeat for those of you who were in the last class, but I think it's worth repeating. I imagine maybe not. Maybe since you came to this class, you're not inclined this way. Here's a really common response when you start asking these questions and telling these stories. Christians are just like, stop, right? Asking these questions is asking for trouble. Like, why are you dwelling on the negative? Trust God's goodness. Flip it over later, it'll look like a tapestry, right? Right now it looks like a mess. Did you all grow up with that analogy? It's not even a bad analogy. I like it. It doesn't help when you're in the middle of the mess, though, right? Or it often doesn't help. So there's a common response that just says, look, we shouldn't keep having these conversations. It's going to turn you into an atheist. If you think too hard about this, you're going to lose your faith. I call it the anti-philosophical response. And I think it's often well-meaning, but I think it's almost always very dangerous. I think it's very dangerous. I don't think everybody has to go to school and major in philosophy. But I think we have to be willing to ask hard questions for a lot of reasons. So, as I said here, I think the anti-philosophical response is on the stage first. Slide, please. Because it usually comes from a place of fear and not a place of faith. It's true, as far as I know. I have seen no reason to believe that all of the people who died in Hurricane Irma, or Hurricane Katrina, or this last one whose name I'm blanking on right now, that all of them were non-believers, that none of them prayed. There's no reason to believe that. There's overwhelming reason to believe that many of them died praying. This is an awful thing to talk about, but this is something that people live through. And so if we just choose not to talk about it, we're not actually addressing it, right? And I'm actually going to read. No, I'm not, because it's not in this chapter. There's a book review on Amazon of a woman who read Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And she tells this little story about how she grew up in the church and she started asking questions. And she says, and I was basically told not to ask questions. She said, but I wouldn't accept that. And so, long story short, she starts looking at the people who will talk about this that she can find. And who's that? It's the new atheists online, right? Because often, if somebody has found a problem like this, if somebody is struggling, and you say, you need to stop thinking about that, what they're going to hear is, the church doesn't have answers to that question, right? We don't have answers for that. If you look too hard, you're going to find nothing. That is not faith in the truth of Christianity. That is fear that Christianity doesn't hold up under scrutiny, right? Not always. I'm not saying it always comes from fear. It might also just be fear. You might think, oh, I'm sure a smarter Christian can figure it out. I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to figure it out. Okay, then turn to the smarter Christians, right? Read books by people who are worrying about this, especially if somebody in your life is dealing with this, and you don't feel equipped. Pick a book to read with them. Tim Keller's book is great. I know he's a pastor, not technically a Christian philosopher. It's a very good book. But yeah, usually this movement to just not talk about it, to not think too hard. I think if you have that impulse, you should ask yourself, what am I afraid of? Don't I believe that God is truth? Don't I believe that God is providential? And no, I may not understand all of it, right? I'm not telling you that studying philosophy is going to make you suddenly understand all the suffering in the world. It won't, right? But it might help you to find ways to understand it and to do something other than just ignore it, which, second slide, never works, right? If somebody is really, really struggling with something and you say, well, why don't you just not worry about it? You don't offer them sort of guidance. You don't help them talk through what the possibilities are. You just say, just don't think about that. I mean, if it's something outrageous, I don't know, if they have a fully nonsensical, irrational fear, I'm worried my cat might be an alien, then you can just say, hey, I don't really know if you can even worry about that. But if you're I can't make sense of the fact that this person I love got cancer right now, at this point in their life, that doesn't make any sense, right? Or I can't understand why God would allow this storm to hit these people over and over again. How many storms they're going to get hit by, right? Telling them, just don't worry about it, is just not going to help them. It's not going to change their level of worry at all. And third, next slide, it's just that we can do better. We've got thousands of years of smart Christians thinking through this stuff and writing down their thoughts. And if you don't want to go back and read it behind this, you can listen to a podcast. Right now is such an awesome time to be a Christian philosopher. philosopher because I think it's the combination of, I think it's a combination of a lot of things. One of which is probably that college professors are wondering what colleges are going to look like in 10 years or 20 years and how many jobs there will be for philosophers. But the upshot is, there are so many podcasts and YouTube channels and websites that are Christian philosophers trying to make their content popularly accessible. So we can do better than just not answering or asking these questions. We can try to address them together. But finally, and I will get to the problem of evil, but these are the kind of problems of the anti-philosophical response that I had, that we talked about earlier in the first half of the class. But there's also actually one in particular for the problem of evil. We can go to the next slide. When we allow ourselves to persist in the belief that serious harm couldn't come to us or our loved ones, I think we open the door to two dangers. I'm just reading from the book here, which is maybe a little silly. But what do I mean by that? I think if we want to turn away from the problem of evil, that usually involves some degree of self-deception, some degree of telling ourselves that at least this couldn't happen to us, right? Or if it's going to happen to us, I'm just not going to think about that right now. But here are the two dangers. Sorry, next slide. In the first place, I think that we run the risk that our own faith will just collapse the moment we learn that we're not actually immune. The day that you learn that, yes, even you could lose this thing that you love so much. If I could say this without crying, but, family that just left Cameron Covenant when they moved a couple years ago. We just read today that this very young mother lost her baby. He was like 6 days old. You believe these things can't really happen to you because it's really almost not within our power to imagine it, right? It's very hard to live life knowing all the things that could happen. And I'm not challenging you to do that. I don't think you have to wake up every day and say, okay, now remember, today could be terrible, right? I don't advise that at all. But the opposite is also dangerous, where you just say, well, so far I'm good, so I don't have to think about that, because I'm good. The first is that then, when you're not good, you have to think about it. And that's not a great time to do it. It's really hard to tackle the problem of evil when you are in the midst of profound suffering. It's much better to do the mental work ahead of time, if you can. But the second danger, next slide, is that we'll fail to be sufficiently gracious, compassionate, and supportive to those around us who are suffering these losses. Anybody who has gone through a very hard time knows that some people just hide. They don't know what to say to you, and so they just avoid you. There's a sense in which this is a totally human reaction, but it's hurtful, and it's one we should guard against, I think. And so if you choose to just not think about the problem of evil, you're just putting yourself in a vulnerable place, and you're putting yourself in a position where you may not be able to be the body of Christ like you're supposed to be to somebody who is going through this awful suffering. Okay, we can go to the next slide. I think we just face the problem. Next slide, please, Richard. Sorry. Oh, I didn't, that was the next slide. I forgot to read the end of the quote. Sorry. The rest of it was just saying I think the scripture is actually pretty clear that we will face suffering. And also clear that God is loving. Scripture is clear about both of those things. God is loving, God is good, God is in control, you will suffer. So obviously Scripture doesn't see a contradiction there. It's not like the Bible tells us God is in control, so you'll be fine. It's just not biblical at all. The Bible tells us God is in control, like that verse, that so commonly misquoted verse. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, which is a great verse, and it's a true verse. But it's not saying, you can ace the LSATs because of Jesus. It's not what it's saying. It's saying you can ace the LSATs, or you can fail the LSATs. And you can endure either of those things through Christ who strengthens you. Right? Scripture, if you don't believe me, go back and read the context. He's like, I was in prison, and also out of prison. I was starving, and also well-fed. And I really think I'm not actually a linguistic scholar, but my preferred translation says, I can endure all things through Christ who gives me strength. Okay, so we face the problem. And we can actually just get right to the next slide. I'm going to do this again. Now, all of a sudden, this is complicated and philosophical, and I get that. But I'm going to go through 3 versions of the philosophical problem of evil. And we'll talk about them. The first is what we call the logical problem of evil. And this one really does try to say that actually, if you understand the definition of God, it is impossible for there to be a God in a world with suffering. So I'll just read through it. If God exists, God is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. This is just, we call this the God of the philosophers, or sometimes they'll call it the 5-0 God. Omnipotent, omnibenevolent, all those, right? It's just like, this is what God means. And so if we're not going to sort of use the word God in a vague, meaningless way, at the very least, if God exists, he's all-powerful and loving, right? And all-knowing. So if God is omnipotent, all-powerful, then he has the power to eliminate all evil. If God is omniscient, then God knows when evil exists. And if God is morally perfect, then God has a desire to eliminate all evil. But if you put that together, it seems if God exists, evil does not exist. But evil does exist. So it seems like God does not exist. I'm not going to spend very long on this one for a couple of reasons. It's not really actually a valid argument. So an argument is valid, we say, when the premises actually guarantee the conclusion. This one looks like it's valid at first glance. It looks like, well, yeah, if you grant all of the premises are just the reasons, right? So yeah, if you just assume that 1 through 6 are true, then it seems like 7 has to be true. It's absolutely the case. Just a little logic note. Premises 5 and 6 plus 7, those 3 together, would actually make a valid argument, right? You don't really care about that. Maybe you do. If God exists, evil does not exist. Evil does exist, therefore God does not exist. That's perfectly fine. That's valid. It's not possible for both of those things to be true. The problem is this. You can't really get 6. I can't really get 5 from 1 through 4. And I feel like they see the problem here. We don't want to take a gander. Yeah,
Premise 4.
Premise 4 is wrong. If God is morally perfect, then God has the desire to eliminate all evil. It's not actually the same as saying if God is morally perfect, then God does eliminate all evil. He might want to, but also want other things. And it might be impossible to have all the things. Particularly, as we'll see next week, if one of the things that you want is creatures with free will, right? If one of the things that you want is for there to be creatures that have what we like to call morally significant free will, the actual ability to make meaningful choices, not just, cake or pie. I'm not against choices between cake and pie, but choices that have actual substantive meaning. Again, this is part of what we'll talk about next week. It's called the free will defense. But the point is, that almost nobody, the only people who continue to advance like a deductive logical problem of evil, trying to prove that it's impossible that God exists, are silly atheists on the internet. Really. Even the academic atheists have long since conceded that of course it's possible that there is a God and that there's evil in the world. That of course these things don't rule each other out, right? We can go to the next slide. This is the much more powerful, it's a much more popular argument now, but because it is a much more difficult and much more challenging argument. This statement comes from a man named William Rowe, and he tells 2 stories. And the first is of a doe, a baby deer. He specifies a baby doe, right? In the woods, caught in forest fire. He's not retelling an actual story, but he's just saying, look, if we look at nature, we know that this kind of thing happens sometimes. Animals burn to death, and sometimes they just get very seriously injured, and sometimes it takes them a few days to die, and presumably they suffer a lot, right? And not just one, but there's a lot of animal suffering. And then he tells another story that I won't share in detail. But if you read the news, you've read stories like this. It's just about a child who is killed in a horrible way, right? And not killed in a quick, horrible way. And unfortunately, that happens, right? It absolutely happens. So what does he say? He says, look, you're right, okay, it's possible. It's totally conceivable. We can imagine that there might be a God who still allowed there to be some suffering for the sake of freedom, or for the sake of some kind of greater good. But, he says, there seem to be, for he says, there exist instances of intense suffering, which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good, or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. This is very wordy, so philosophers of sins just use the word gratuitous, right? There seems to be some suffering that is gratuitous. It seems like it's more than would be necessary to bring about the kinds of good things that God would want to bring about. So, the second premise basically says God would prevent those things. An omniscient, holy good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it couldn't do so, without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. As you'll see in later slides, now we sort of tend to call the first premise the factual premise and the second premise the theological premise. But the first premise just says, there are really awful things that don't seem to serve any good. The second premise says, a good God would only allow suffering if it did prevent worse suffering or bring about some greater good, right? So there seems to be gratuitous suffering. It seems like a good God wouldn't allow that kind of thing. And so, next slide. God doesn't exist. Again, if we move to the next slide, this is the last statement. Because over the years, even Rowe himself said, all right, okay, my argument doesn't really show that it's impossible that God exists. It just seems unlikely. So this is the more common, most common argument. It comes out of the same kind of problem. It's different because it's what we call an inductive argument instead of a deductive argument. Flashback to your logic class, right? So it doesn't try to show that it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. It grants that it's possible. This is the kind of argument that deals in likelihoods or probabilities, right? It's like, let's just look at the evidence. It's called the evidential argument for people. Let's look at the evidence and see what the most likely conclusion is. And it says, there are instances of intense suffering that seem to us to be gratuitous. If God exists, then there are no instances of actually gratuitous suffering, right? So there's suffering that seems gratuitous to us. But if God exists, there's no actually gratuitous suffering. Therefore, either God does not exist, or these instances of suffering, or none of these instances of suffering is gratuitous. Sorry, I should just look here. This will be better. So either God doesn't exist, or none of these instances of suffering is gratuitous. He just justified by some hidden greater good. But then the next premise says, it's more likely that God doesn't exist than that every one of these instances of suffering is justified by some hidden greater good. How do they defend that? They just say, there's a lot. Just pick one kid. In fact, one of the most powerful statements of this problem is a chapter of a novel by Dostoevsky. If you like Russian fiction at all, if you didn't hate Crime and Punishment when you were made to read it in school, you should read The Brothers Karamazov, because I kind of did hate Crime and Punishment. And The Brothers Karamazov is probably a top 5 book for me, maybe top 10. But there's a chapter in it called Rebellion, and another chapter called The Grand Inquisitor, and a character in there who actually doesn't even deny the existence of God, doesn't even deny the divinity of Jesus. But he just says, look, if my entrance to heaven was purchased on the back of a suffering kid, I return that ticket. I don't want it, right? If you think that it's okay to let kids suffer to bring about some great plan that restores me, It's difficult, it's powerful. I actually teach at USF. It's a hard thing to read. But again, I think it's better that we not turn away from these hard things, even if they make us very uncomfortable. So this argument basically says there are so many of these instances where we don't see any good. And we don't even really imagine what would be a good that would outweigh this awful thing. And so what's more likely? That we're just missing all these good things? Or that we're fooling ourselves about God? William Rowe, who actually was a devout Christian, which I just find so sad, he thinks no. We were fooling ourselves. There is so much suffering, God must not exist. So, I told you today would be a little bit of a downer, right? We're not done. But this is the evidential argument. If we go to the next slide, please. The central claim of all of these arguments is basically this. The prevalence of evil in the world makes it either logically impossible or at least very unlikely that God exists. This is the central claim. This is the challenge to religious believers, to theists. It's especially the challenge to Christians. I mean, I'm at least especially concerned with the challenge to Christians. I also think Christianity has a unique response in that we believe that God took suffering on himself. I think any Christian response that doesn't take that into account is missing something huge, right? One other religion says that God himself, in addition to allowing us to suffer, to restore us, suffered himself, right? But if we go to the next slide, here's the funny thing about the problem of evil. People who advance this argument say that it's this prevalence of evil that makes the existence of God unlikely. But then if you stop and ask what they mean by that word evil, things get tricky. Because quite a lot of the people who advance this argument don't really believe in evil. They don't believe that there is any such thing as objective moral values. Values that are grounded in anything other than just what we tell each other, right? And what we collectively decide. So as you'll see over the course of this 4-week class, actually, on some construals, it seems like if there really is evil, then we have to believe that there's a God. Because it's very difficult to make sense of where good and bad, evil and goodness, would even come from. This is not the same as saying, like, Christians are better people than atheists. But people who believe in God have more resources to make sense of the claim that there is good and evil than people who don't. So if we go to the next slide. In the book, I sort of just parse them out because I have to have a way to keep them straight. So I say evil one, like the philosophers do this, we add a little number to the word. The first construal of evil just is something that's bad, harmful, painful, otherwise unpleasant. I just like read some definitions, right, and tried to tease out the way that this one word is used in 2 very different ways. Everybody knows that this kind of evil exists. Everybody knows that stuff happens that's unpleasant, that we wouldn't like to have happen, that we wouldn't prefer, that makes us sad, that makes us angry, that makes us feel bad. This kind of evil is completely uncontroversial. Next slide, please. But we also sometimes use the word evil to mean something that is like malicious, or cruel, or otherwise immoral. This construal of evil says that evil is wrong, right? It's contrary to how the world ought to be, or if you do an act that is evil, it's contrary to how you should act. But then you have to ask, where's the should coming from? Right? What is grounding, we call them moral obligations, right? If you should do one thing, and you should not do another, like on what basis? Where's this coming from? If we go to the next slide, this is Richard Dawkins. Looks like such a nice fellow there. Next slide. I guess I went too soon. It's all right. In one of his books, River Out of Eden, Richard Dawkins tells a story of a school bus. It's another sad story. But it's a school bus full of Catholic school children. A school bus from a Catholic school crashed for no reason anybody could tell nobody was to blame, it was just an accident, the kids died. And so a reporter on the scene asked the local priest, this was in London, this is all just coming from Dawkins' book, right? But a reporter asked the local priest, like, how do you, let me read this rather than just saying it. A local journalist asked the question, how can you believe in a loving, all-powerful God who allows such a tragedy? And this priest, according to Dawkins, answered as follows. The simple answer is that we do not know why there should be a God who lets these awful things happen. But the horror of the crash, to a Christian, confirms the fact that we live in a world of real values, positive and negative. If the universe was just electrons, there would be no problem of evil or suffering. See what he means? You've got to read Dawkins' response in the next slide. Dawkins writes, on the contrary, if the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, meaningless tragedies like the crashing of this bus are exactly what we should expect, along with equally meaningless good fortune. Such a universe would be neither good nor evil in intention. The universe we observe is precisely the properties we should expect. If there is a bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. He goes on to say, DNA neither knows nor cares when we dance to its music. Totally, a little bit callous, but his point there is, he's like, no, I mean, the priest is right on this one point. If this world isn't created and sustained by God, then these words that we use, good and evil, don't actually mean anything. They're just preferences, right? There's the stuff that we like and the stuff that we don't like. But if you want to go further and really blame people, if you want to really believe that there are ways you ought to live and ways you ought not to live, and think that that actually has any kind of substantive meaning, it's very hard to make sense of that without God. So, we'll go to the next slide. This is a quote from a woman, I love her, Eleanor Stuck. She's a Christian philosopher, St. Louis. And she has this book called Wandering in Darkness, which I would absolutely recommend, except it's like 650 pages long. And it's very much an academic philosophy text. However, she's on a podcast. Evan Rosa is his name. He has a podcast called The Table. And he interviews her and asks her to give like a 45-minute version of her 650-page book. And it's great. That podcast is so good. You may not agree with everything that she says in it, but a lot of what she says is powerful and insightful, and she does a particularly good job of addressing the problem of evil as a philosopher and a human. For a long time, philosophers just tackled it as philosophers without remembering that they were humans, right? Without thinking about the fact that it's not just a mental problem, it's not just a conceptual problem, it's an experiential problem. People live suffering, they deal with suffering. But as she says, if we're looking at the actual philosophical problem, it's not really a problem of evil, it's a problem of suffering. There is no tension at all between the existence of a good God and the existence of evil, which is to say, actions contrary to the design and plan of a good God. That's no tension. That makes sense. We can make better sense of evil, being evil, if we understand that it is opposed to a good, loving God. So there is no problem of evil. Or if there is, there's not much of a problem. The real problem is the problem of suffering. The real problem is making sense of a loving God that allows suffering. So if we go to the next slide. Very roughly summarized, I think the problem of suffering is there's a great deal of suffering. It seems to us to be gratuitous. Next slide, please. We call this the factual premise. We being philosophers, right? But it's helpful. It'll be helpful next week because when we talk about responses, we'll talk about which premise they're targeting. But the factual premise is a claim about what the world is like. There seems to be this kind of suffering in the world. And there doesn't seem to be any obvious goods that come from it, right? So it's not like the suffering, like the pain of childbirth, which gives you a child, or the pain of, inoculation, which gives you immunity, or the pain of, exercise, which gives you strength, right? There are lots of cases where we can see, well, you suffer, and then as a result of that suffering, something great comes about. Our culture really loves grit, right? You need a little suffering, and then you get strong, right? Well, this says, but there's more than that. there seems to be suffering that doesn't seem to produce anything good. And the next premise says it also seems like God would prevent gratuitous suffering. Maybe he wouldn't prevent all suffering, but the gratuitous stuff seems like he would prevent that. And next slide, we call this the theological premise. Because this is a claim about God. Right? The first premise is a claim about the world, but this is a claim about what we believe about God. We think that this is how God would act. So, next slide. The conclusion is it seems like God does not exist. Next slide, please. We'll have time for questions. I'm not going to go a whole hour. Moving forward, next week, we're going to talk about two ways. I do kind of apologize that we're not getting to these this week. But I really want to do justice to the wrong people. I know that might sound terrible, but I think it's so easy to dismiss it too quickly. I think it's so easy to jump right to easy answers. And I think that people who are in the midst of suffering have to really feel the full force of it. And I genuinely believe, in fact, I can tell a story. Some of you have heard me tell the story because it made this massive impact on my life. Huge. When I was an undergraduate, I got to work with a professor. And this was such a big deal because this was, what year was this? This was the year 2000, or 2001. And we were going to design a course that you could take on a computer. We were changing a textbook into an online course. This is like one of the first of these things, right? This is a very big deal. People weren't really doing this yet. It required massive amounts of hard drive space. There was no cloud. None of these things existed. There was no Zoom, for example. But what that meant was I got to actually interview Christian philosophers, ask them questions, because for each chapter of the book, we would interview the author and do a little 5-minute video with them. And in a strange turn of events, one of the authors who wrote on the problem of evil, was at that time dealing with brain cancer as a father with young children. So we get to go and talk to him. I didn't actually get to be for this interview, but I was editing it, so I'm watching this interview like 500 times. So my friend's asking him to talk about the problem of evil. And, off camera, on camera, but to be edited out, he says, okay, I want you to say something about how, your philosophical response to the problem of evil is not like a counseling tool. This is not the kind of thing you want to say to somebody at the hospital bed, right? So say something about the difference between, caring for people who are suffering and the philosophical problem of suffering. And so he starts the camera, and he starts to talk, and he said, no, I want you to, and he stops. And he said, I can't say that. Because he said, it has been awful dealing with cancer and with my own mortality with young children. It's been incredibly difficult. It's been painful. It's been exhausting. But it hasn't actually shaken my faith because I have spent so many years thinking about this. And so for me, it has been a huge help because I haven't had to wrestle through the question, why would God allow this? Because I already did that. And he said, so for me, it has been a helpful pastoral tool. Because for all my fear and all my worries and my hurting, at least I've already reconciled the reality. The truth is that it's just so easy to think that these things happen to other people. And that can keep us from taking the extra step to just asking ourselves, will I still serve God if it happens to me? Will I still trust God if it happens to me? And by it, I mean pick whatever the one thing is that you can't imagine going through. Because sometimes that's what happens to people. And these are people that God loves. So that's, I guess, why I really want to make sure that I can do what I can. Look, it stinks to sit in a classroom and listen to horrible stories, but it's so much better than living through those stories, right? And if we could take the opportunity to get ourselves to get there before we're thrust there by life's circumstances, I really think it helps. For me, it did. I had a long stretch of years that were incredibly difficult when I was younger. People just kept dying. People that I loved, people at the wrong age, people who were not supposed to die, at the age they did or in the way that they did. I don't know what it was. A stretch of years. And I was in college and I had a professor who, instead of telling me not to think about it, like gave me C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce and gave me good books to read to sort of work through this stuff. So that's my explanation for why I'm maybe belaboring the point of the reality of suffering. But next week we will talk about responses, and we'll start with these two: skeptical theism and the free will of defense. Skeptical theism is not what it sounds like. It sounds like you're a skeptic about theism. I don't know why they called it skeptical theism. I would not have chosen that title. Skeptical theism is theism. It's the belief in God, and it's usually it's most of the skeptical theists writing today are Christians. There are also some, like Jewish and Muslim philosophers writing today. Skeptical theism is often a Christian position. And as you'll see next week, it actually calls into question the factual premise. So the factual premise says there's gratuitous suffering in this world. Skeptical theism says we're like infants compared to God. What makes us think that we would see God's reasons, God's justifications? What makes us think that we can see what might be necessary to bring about some great good? We have such limited vision. And if you think about the vast moral reality that God creates and sustains and upholds, and the vastness of God's knowledge, the skeptical theist just says, we've got no reason to believe that we should be able to find the justification for suffering. Maybe it doesn't help as much in the moment, right? Because you want to find. You just want to know it's for something, right? If you're going through something awful, you want to know something good is going to come of it. The skeptical theism says, yeah, you may want that, but there's no reason to believe that you're going to get it in this world. And the free will defense goes a little further, and they say, well, I don't know if we have to be that pessimistic. The free will defense says, maybe there is like one overriding good that explains so much of this suffering, and that is the goodness of genuine, morally significant free will. In fact, this was fascinating. I just read those two chapters from Dostoevsky in the literature class I teach at USF. I'm a philosophy professor, but they let me teach a literature class. It's awesome, because it's philosophical, religious and philosophical themes in literature. So it's totally, I would teach it all the time if I could. But yeah, we worked through these chapters where Yvonne says, return my ticket. And this Grand Inquisitor puts Jesus on trial, basically. The whole point of the Grand Inquisitor, this chapter of the Brothers Karamazov, is like Jesus comes back, not for his second coming, just to kind of hop in. And the Grand Inquisitor says to him, you don't get to say another word. You already said what you were going to say, and you gave people free will. What are you thinking? We're not made for this. People are terrible. There's nothing more aggressive to people than their own free will. He says there's nothing human beings want more than a community of bowing down. They want somebody to bow down to, and they want to agree with each other about who that is, right? Otherwise, there's just war and violence and mayhem. And so the Great Inquisitor says that he, in the church, this is Dostoevsky's story, not mine. He says, we've taken their freedom for them. And because you gave it to them, and that was a mistake. And so instead, we've replaced you with our rules, right? And they give us their freedom, and we're not really following them anymore, right? But they don't know that, so it's okay. And I asked my students, who's right here? Do you want to find Jesus or the Grand Inquisitor? And I asked them, would you rather live in a world without morally significant freedom, but also with no suffering? Or in a world with suffering and morally significant freedom? And I think I always expect the class to be more divided than it is on that question. Out of 50 students, 3 of them picked the world with no free will and no suffering. Almost the entire class said, no, I don't want to. And it's always, I don't want to be a robot, I don't want to be a puppet, I don't want to be a drone, right? So the free will defense says, yeah, maybe that's reality. But of course, you can't give creatures morally significant free will and then prevent them from exercising it. It's actually contradictory. Either they are free to make good and bad choices, and what's going to happen? Some of them are going to do awful things, right? Or they're not free. So, okay, we have next week for that. I don't have to teach it now. But next week we'll look at these two defenses that say, first of all, maybe we don't have the reasons, maybe we don't have access to that. And the second one that says, well, we can still make some effort to figuring out what it might be, and maybe it's this, right? And then the week after that, we're going to talk about this other kind of evil. And the reasons why we ought to believe. And I will say, as I talk about in the book, even serious atheistic ethicists or atheistic moral philosophers, not all of them, but a lot of them absolutely recognize that, like, no, we need objective moral values. This idea that what's right for you and what's right for me doesn't have to be the same thing is very popular among, like, undergraduates in the classroom. It's not very popular among academic philosophers because it takes very little thinking to realize this is a path to devastation, right? This just goes badly very quickly. So we'll talk about that next week, about why we can't content ourselves with relativism about morality. Why that ends up, you end up having to say terrible things right away. It's so easy to convince students that relativism is nonsense. It takes like 5 minutes. Making it stick, I have found almost impossible. By the next week, they're back to the relativism. It's like, but we never talked about this. And it's because it's everywhere. You can't compete with it everywhere, right? You're steeped in it. But it doesn't make any sense. I think it's dangerous. So we'll talk about that the third week, about why we need objective moral values. And then the next slide, the last week. So the final argument I gave today is what we call an inference to the best explanation. You just say, look, here's this thing. Here's what I think is the best explanation. The evidential argument from evil says, look at all this suffering that seems gratuitous. The best explanation is that there is no God. Well, the last week we'll look at something called the moral argument that says, look how much we need objective moral values. And then we'll compare. Because there are, again, academic philosophers who are atheists who give moral theories that are supposed to be objective moral values in a world without God. I just think they're wildly impossible. So we'll look at the atheistic, so we're 1 week on why moral values are objective, and then the next week on why theism is a better explanation than atheism. Why, if you want to accept the reality of moral values, your options for making sense of that on atheism are so slim. And on theism, on Christianity in particular, it's exactly what you would expect, right? Of course, if God exists, goodness is real. God is good. God is goodness himself, right? Of course, if God exists, there are right ways to live and wrong ways to live. We were created by a God according to a plan. Like, it's perfectly straightforward if God exists. It's convoluted and weird if he doesn't. So that will be the last class. We will end with an argument for the existence of God. One last slide. Closing thoughts, just because I love Eleanor's stuff so much. She writes, this is in a paper she wrote, any attempt to solve the problem of evil must try to provide some understanding of the suffering of children, right? Of the suffering that's just particularly hard to make sense of. She says, but must not lessen our pain over that suffering if it is not to become something monstrous and inhumane. I don't know, I can't fully explain this. Why did I choose this to end on? I guess just to kind of keep in mind, right? Because I guess here's why. I absolutely 100% believe that Christianity has an answer to the problem of suffering. But I don't think we should get so cocky about that we forget how awful suffering is for the sufferers, right? You don't want to lose sight of that. So if, like, somebody you love is caught in the grips of this, no, when someone you love, and maybe you, are caught in the grips of this, right? turn off any expectation that like the philosophical answer should fix the hurt. I don't think it's biblical, and I don't think it has to be the case. Like, even if we can absolutely make sense of why God, in His wisdom, would allow this kind of suffering, doesn't change the fact that it's hard, right? Doesn't change the fact that it's hard, and it doesn't change the fact that it's like just a difficult thing to live in. So,